All right, what we're doing today is we are going to try to explain why George Washington was nominated to take command of the Continental Army in 1775. The George Washington that we know, the George Washington pictured here in this picture from the Capitol Rotunda, the apotheosis of George Washington, is one of the greatest figures in American history. He is the indispensable man of the Revolution. But it didn't always have to be that way. It could have gone in a very different direction if John Adams had not nominated Washington to be the commander of the Continental Army. So, all right, first and foremost, it was a matter of colonial unity. John Adams, Sam Adams, many of the radicals of the Continental Congress were from Massachusetts. They had found a number of kindred spirits in the Virginia delegation at the Continental Congress, and George Washington was without a doubt one of the most, if not the most impressive man from Virginia. So there was a certain amount of political calculation involved in nominating George Washington. Okay, first of all, the city of Boston is under siege. In April of 1775, the British decided to march on to Lexington and Concord. At Lexington, they were hoping to grab John Hancock and Sam Adams, some of the leadership of the rebellious colonists in that period of time. Then the plan was to go on to Concord and seize a number of military stores that the Massachusetts militia had stored. Both the Battle of Lexington and Concord were fought. The British had to deal with a very murderous and torturous march back to the city of Boston. Within a matter of hours, days, the city of Boston was ringed by colonial militias from as far away as Connecticut and New York and Vermont. And the city basically entered into a period of one of the greatest staring matches in military history. Next, so this staring contest really had a name. It was the Army of Observation. At the time, the Army was basically being supported by the people of Massachusetts, and it was sitting there. Since it wasn't fighting, it was just sort of watching what was going on. They came to be sort of known as the New England Army, the Army of New England, the Army of Observation. The summer of 1775, before George Washington arrived in Massachusetts, this is actually about taking place at about the same time that George Washington is nominated and accepts the appointment, is the Battle of Bunker Hill. By far the bloodiest battle of the Revolutionary War was fought very early in the Revolutionary War. The Americans had entrenched on high ground above Boston Harbor. Any American artillery placed on that high ground would make it inhospitable for the British warships in the harbor. So it was decided that the Americans had to be removed, and they were in fact removed from Bunker Hill, or actually from Breed's Hill, at a terrible cost to the British Army. Over 1,000 British casualties were inflicted by the Americans. The Americans lost about 300 men. So it was a pretty nasty battle, and it had a pretty major impact on both sides of the Atlantic. And this is the situation that George Washington is coming into. Massachusetts was out of money. They could no longer support this army. It was the goal of the Massachusetts delegates of Congress to get Congress to adopt to take over this army. Ultimately, they will do so. They will take over this army, and now, obviously, Congress has an army. Now it has to appoint a commander. Okay? So what you have right now is you have essentially a war with no consensus as to what to do about it. There are people like the Adamses and a number of the Virginia delegates and a number of Pennsylvania delegates who are firebrands, who understand that the only possible resolution to this situation, now that it has resorted to a contest of arms, is independence. Conversely, you have what I like to call a lot of squishy people in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania who from the beginning thought almost entirely about reconciliation. You know, this Congress, this political movement is designed primarily to bring about reconciliation with the mother country. And these are two fundamentally different objectives that are running essentially along parallel tracks within the Congress. You've got the Adamses of Massachusetts trying to pull the country towards an independency, and you've got, for example, John Dickinson of Pennsylvania exerting every ounce of his fiber to keep the country essentially tied in some form to England and come up with some satisfactory constitutional arrangement. That's the situation. But in the meantime, there is a war, and a war has to be fought, and an army has to be supplied, and it has to be commanded. So the question is, who is going to command it? Well, for John Adams, it's all about colonial unity. It's all about making common cause with the other half of this country. John Adams knows you can't expect a heck of a lot out of New York. You can't expect a heck of a lot out of New Jersey. You can't expect a heck of a lot out of Pennsylvania. But you can expect a full measure of support from the delegates of Virginia, and that is where he wants to hook them. So the first and foremost reason why George Washington is selected to command the American army outside of Boston is because he's a Virginian. He's a Virginian. He is going to bring other Virginians into this fight, and he is going to give it a continental flavor as opposed to a purely Massachusetts, New England provincial affair. That's the bottom line. This is revealed quite clearly in a letter that John wrote to his wife Abigail immediately after the nomination of George Washington as the commander of the army. I can now inform you that the Congress have made choice of the modest and virtuous, the amiable, generous, and brave George Washington, Esquire, to be the general of the American army, and that he is to repair as soon as possible to the camp before Boston. This appointment will have a great effect in cementing and securing the union of these colonies. Now, the number one reason, it's a matter of colonial unity. That brings us to number two. Number two, it's a matter of experience. Okay, without a doubt, George Washington had a tremendous amount of experience. First, he led an expedition to remove the French from building the fort at the fort on the forks of the Ohio and Monongahela. It came to be known as Fort Duquesne, and the French had sort of occupied territory that the British felt was theirs, and the British were trying to occupy territory the French felt was theirs. Ultimately, George Washington selected to take an expedition out to Fort Duquesne and to remove the French by force if necessary. At the Battle of Fort Necessity, Washington's fallback position, he was defeated. He suffered, his first serious setback in his military career, a few miles from Fort Duquesne at Fort Necessity. Later on, as you can see a picture of General Edward Braddock, a British officer who was sent to the colonies to sort of clean up this unpleasantness on the frontier, led a large British and American force into an ambush on the Monongahela River. George Washington was able to rally the troops, analyzed pretty much what was going on very quickly, pulled some kind of defensive network together, was able to sort of drive off the French and their Indian allies, and whatever men made it back from the Ohio to Virginia alive or got back to Virginia simply because of the heroism and courage and foresight of George Washington. During the French and Indian War, George Washington served as the commander of the Virginia militia. This was critical. What does he learn doing this? Number one, he learns the basics of running an army. Discipline, logistics, supply. What are the 1,001 things that have to be done in order to sustain men under arms and keep them in fighting condition? That's number one. He learns the basic how to manage, administer a fairly complex and large operation like an army. Okay. Another important thing about George Washington is he learned how to manage defeat. He learned how to suffer a setback and rally and keep going. I mean, his trajectory is not a steady upward trajectory of going from one success to another success. I mean, he's going to win some battles. He's going to lose some battles. He learned how to lose well, in a sense, and he learned how to manage defeat, and he learned how to be able to come back and fight another day. That is going to be a very important quality that you're looking for in an army like the American Army during the Revolutionary War. Another important thing about George Washington, too, is he's learned the strengths and the weaknesses of the British Army. He understood the limitations the British Army had when they were beyond the reach of the British Navy. When the British Army is working in conjunction with the British Navy, they are unbeatable. But if you lure the British Army beyond the ability of being supported by the British fleet, they become, a fairly ordinary army with the same problems that just about every other army on the face of the earth has. So the man has the experience. No other man in America that's on the Patriot side had commanded as many men in battle for as prolonged a period of time as had George Washington. So that's the second most important reason why George Washington is the guy. It's because of his experience. Okay. Third, the commanding presence. The guy looked like a general. The guy looked like a leader of men. Okay, it was almost as if, in a Hollywood movie, somebody called Central Casting and said, send us a general type. They would send you George Washington. He looked like a general, as I said. He had a heroic level of self-control. Washington probably understood that his greatest fault was his immense temper, and he spent a lifetime trying to master his temper. He was unflappable. He was steady. Did not mean he was without personality. It did not mean he was without charm. He just was a steady, solid, heroic-looking individual. George Washington, he did not actively seek the job. He did not go around touting his reputation. He did not go around flaunting his experience. He did show up to the Second Continental Congress wearing a uniform. I mean, that was probably a pretty big tip as to what his intentions or what his desires were. But for the most part, he just sat back. He kind of surveyed the landscape, understood that inevitably everything sort of pointed towards him, and all he needed to do was just sort of sit there and wait for it to come in his direction. The other thing about Washington, too, is that he understood how to play the game of disinterested humility, okay? That he was a man who, quite literally, in the words of the Declaration of Independence, was willing to risk his life, his fortune, and his sacred honor. He had a tremendous amount to lose. Like so many other Americans of wealth and influence, he could have simply sat this one out and protected his fortune. There were numerous wealthy landowners throughout America who were able to play the neutrality game and were able to play one side off the other, able to sort of sidestep all of the issues of the age to protect their property. But that was not George Washington. I mean, everybody understood that he had the most to lose of all of them in his decision to go the route of armed resistance and to go the route ultimately of independence. Okay, so if we take a look, and the final thing I guess that we want to take a look at is we want to take a look at Washington's humility. Once he had been accepted as the commander, once he had been voted on by Congress, and he basically made sort of a humble thank you to the Congress. Mr. President, though I am truly sensible of the high honor done me in this appointment, yet I feel great distress from a consciousness that my abilities and military experience may not be equal to the extensive and important trust. However, as the Congress desire it, I will enter upon the momentous duty and exert every power I possess in their service and for support of the glorious cause. I beg they will accept my most cordial thanks for this distinguished testimony of their approbation. But lest some unlucky event should happen unfavorable to my reputation, I beg it may be remembered by every gentleman in the room that I this day declare with the utmost sincerity I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with. Okay, and that was on June 16, 1776. Now, to be honest, George Washington is not qualified to assume the command he is about to embark on. He never commanded more than 1,000 men with the Virginia Regiment. He is now going to have to command anywhere between 7,000 and 25,000 men throughout the Revolutionary War. He is going to leave a lot of loose ends undone, some of which might result in his being undone. But I'll tell you one thing about Washington. He is a quick study. He does have a very sharp learning curve, and he's not likely to make the same mistake twice. Okay? Well, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you found it useful. I imagine a couple of these things will show up on your next test. And what can I say except the end?